Hello, everyone. I wanted to follow up the video I did last week on a time of rest, of God's rest specifically, and just the importance of rest to be able to open up our awareness of God's presence in our lives. I wanted to follow that up with a time to work. Even though in the pandemic there's just so much that our hands are tied, we cannot do, we cannot go places, we cannot assume the usual habits or schedules or agendas that we have had in the past. There's a lot for most of us that have had to change because of the pandemic. How do we work in the midst of all of these changes? What do we do? How do we proceed to work in this very changed environment in such a way that we are not exhausted in it, but we are able to establish more deeply in God's rest, because that is what He wants, for us to be established in His rest. And I wanted to talk a little bit to kind of start with an understanding of that, about the work of a psychiatrist by the name of Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. What Frankl worked on and studied a lot was how the way human beings experience whatever their circumstances are very much based on how we approach our circumstances. Specifically, how we approach in light of what we are valuing of our circumstances. Valuing focuses us on what it is that we are valuing. It informs how we invest in whatever it is we are engaged in or valuing. It informs how we understand or identify the importance or worth of what we are valuing. So Frankl understood that how we understand the meaning of however we are approaching our circumstances or living out our life is central to our experience of life and living in the midst of whatever circumstances we are in. Frankl's book shows very dramatically the importance of the meaning we direct or give to our circumstances, and the importance in our experience of those circumstances. He had gone through years in a concentration camp in the Holocaust, and he recognized that people's experience of the Holocaust, the same environment, the same circumstance, dramatically changed depending on the value or the meaning they gave that experience. So for people whose primary meaning or value was invested in the circumstance and really not much beyond that, needless to say, those people were much more vulnerable to being devastated by the horror of that circumstance, of the Holocaust. He also noticed that there were people whose value was not housed in the circumstances so completely, that there was room for them, that their value went beyond the circumstance to other things that were not necessarily visibly or sensorially present in the circumstance, such as things that they could look forward to once the Holocaust was over, with the expectation, that positive hope that the Holocaust would endure for a time and then end. They would think of reuniting with family, or they could think of a delicious chicken dinner with clean clothes, resting with family, coming together, being at peace. And those simple pleasures, which they lacked completely in the camps, they allowed their focus, their energy to be invested in those meaningful memories and hopes that they were valuing. For those people, Frankl noticed that there was a certain strength, a certain ability that they had to endure through those horrific circumstances. And then, of course, there were those who believed in God, who far exceeds any circumstance that we are going through. And in God, he saw those who believed in God, that they really had much more freedom in the midst of their horrible, devastating circumstances. That is not to say that those circumstances were good for anybody, but it is to say that there were those whose value, who he saw had a value that was greater than the circumstances, who were not as controlled, and those who were actually, some of whom were actually able to redefine those circumstances in very new ways, in very different ways that had value for them. So, needless to say, when we're going through this pandemic, which for all of us, it's, equally we're going through the pandemic. We have different circumstances depending on our living situations, but I don't think any of us would really say the pandemic is a good circumstance or situation. That said, what we are all needing in the midst of this circumstance, which is somewhat difficult for some and very difficult for others, is that we need to be able to see the meaning, the value of these circumstances in ways that allow us to not be controlled by the situation, by the pandemic, but instead to be able to experience a living through it that redefines this pandemic for our good. Now, that is something, when we speak about having a relationship with God, that is central to our experience with God. The Lord doesn't ever want us to be defined by our circumstances or controlled by them. That is why he so much wants to be in the midst of our lives, because he wants us to be in his hold. He wants to be the one who is valuing our life, and the one who is who is sufficiently valuing our life for the worth that it is, and not allowing our circumstances to define or value us. When we rest in God, that allows us to be in the hands of this God who is infinitely greater than our circumstances, and that allows us to start having more and more of the viewpoint, the perspective, the valuing that God gives our circumstances for our sake. I wanted to share a memory that I have that I believe it must be decades old, but it's this memory that has been implanted in my mind and hasn't really left me since I saw it, of a woman, a mother who was holding her baby, and this baby was very uncomfortable in the mother's hand. From my impression, the mother was really holding the baby in a supportive way, in a caring way, but the baby was really just struggling, really wrestling with the mother and arching her back and tensing her body and just pushing at her mother to get away from her mother. And my thought was, well, I'm really glad that your mother has a good hold on you, because if you succeeded in pushing your mother away, you would fall flat on the pavement. So I looked at this baby, and I think part of what it impressed upon me is that it was so contrary to what I usually see of mothers holding their babies. That usually babies are either resting on their mother's breasts, or turning around looking at the world and sort of engaging the world with their eyes, with their hands, with their babbling, with sort of taking in people's delight in seeing these adorable little babies, and kind of engaging freely with the world as the mother is sustaining the baby. The baby is experiencing that mother's sustenance and is free to enjoy all that surrounds her or him. And in that way, that is like a loose parallel or comparison to God's desire to hold us so that we can engage in the world surrounding us without the burden of trying to hold ourselves up, or trying to make value, or trying to have our agenda set the way we think it should. All of those things that we try to impose in our world that are beyond our capacity to hold drain us. And that consequently, we are needing to have more and more of a sense of an understanding of God's holding us so that we can engage in his rest with the rest of the world. And it is in his rest that God informs us of his holy and good ways for our lives. That is why God's Sabbath rest is so central to our relationship with him. Now, how are we able to do that? How are we able to access or connect to God's holiness? And it always, our relationship with the Lord, when we're wanting that intimate relationship and understanding of the nature of God, we need to always approach God in his way, God's way. And so God's way is through God's Messiah, Jesus, who revealed the nature of Jesus's relationship with his God and Father so that we can see and learn from Jesus, not only by beholding Jesus, but also by learning to allow the life of Jesus to inform our life. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." This light burden that Jesus speaks of is in the context, in the light of his relationship with God the Father. I'm just going to refer to one thing that Jesus spoke of with reference to his relationship with his Father, to just sort of describe this nature of his relationship. In John 5, verse 19, Jesus said to the religious leaders, Jewish leaders, "Amen, amen, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself unless it is something he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in like manner." Jesus had a complete dependence on his Father. He understood the trustworthiness of his Father, and so he emptied himself and let his Father totally take over his life. And his Father proved to be faithful. So Jesus is our way that opens our eyes to the faithfulness of God, his Father, in our lives so that we can trust, so that we can rest, so that we can abide in those arms that sustain us even during the pandemic, especially during the pandemic, whatever our hardships. So I pray that these words would speak some words of encouragement to you. One thing I do want to recommend that you think about between now and my next video is that one of the ways we hold on to this burden of thinking we need to hold ourselves up is that we think we know much, much more than we actually do know. We think we should know much, much more than we actually do know. And our assumption that we know what we don't know burdens us excessively. So I may think that the pandemic is a horrible thing for me and that I'm not going to survive it, or that I'm going to lose my job and lose all the things that I had prized or valued before. Well, I don't really know what I'm talking about because I don't know how this is going to run through. All I know is that God is over all of it. I'm in God's hands, and that I need him to get me through it. That I do know, but I don't know exactly where this pandemic is going to proceed in my life. So the more I accept the truth that I don't know what I'm talking about when I make these predictions and assumptions, that settles me to be able to rest more in the all-sufficient hands of God. So I pray that this week, each and every one of us be safe in him.